I want all of us to go through this Learn CSS Layout. It's going to be like a precursor and useful resource for showing an example both in code and in display what happens when you have a good understanding of the options you have for setting up layout for your HTML. Does that make sense to everybody? Utilizing CSS. So the first thing that is mentioned here, I know we're going to get to the place where we're dealing with like actual like position, but one of the first and easy things you can do when it comes to setting up your CSS layout is understanding what margin lets you do. So this one particular thing, using again auto as a keyword, but margin auto, so we have the code that's in CSS at the top, and then the actual div that is being styled at the bottom with some descriptive information about what's happening on the screen, okay? So here is a div with the ID of main, okay? And then you see the corresponding ID main hashtag in the CSS, right? That's applying the following styles. So the width here is being set to 600 pixels. And then you have this second CSS property being set up as margin. Somebody remind me what margin is. So for the box model, right, the inner part is content, right, which is like what's in my stomach, okay? And then what's after content? Padding, which is like your thickness, okay? And then what's after that? Your border, right, which is your skin, like where I end as an element, okay? And then after that is margin, right? The distance between me and another element. So my distance between me and John right now, that's the margin, okay? So setting margin, here we're using a shorthand. So remember, if you recall in CSS, we had a few different shorthands when it comes to top, left, bottom, right, top, right, bottom, left, whichever way you do it when you understand left and right. So if we're using two properties in margin, that means we're doing top, bottom, left, right, okay? So right here, what's being set is a 0 margin, top, bottom, right? And then left, right is going to be automatic to whatever is left. Okay, so that means that the left, right are set automatically to the horizontally. It ends up centering the element within the container that it is in. Okay, so the magic of margin 0 auto means that when you set that on an element, it's going to center itself to the page.
If it's 0 top bottom, shouldn't it be touching the other? Is it touching the other elements? We just can't see their borders or something.
These other pieces might have like more margin that's more like different than that.
So you just can't tell.
Yeah, this might have some different padding or something like that. Yeah. So it describes it here. The left and the right margins are set to automatically to auto. So it horizontally centers the element. Okay, so left, right, that's what margin's being set up with. Okay, and then the browser window being narrower than the width. So you set a width and then you do margin 0 auto and it'll center it, the element, okay, to the place that it, like the space it has available to it. Make sense? Okay, and again, you can go back and like go through these. I go back to this resource often when I'm like, how did this happens? You'll see a lot of jokes around like, oh, I forgot how to center something. That happens all the time. And you go back to the docs, just like, you know, I forgot that Ruby has, you know, a certain method, right? You always go back to the docs or resources that, you know, are always there for you. Thank you, Google. Okay.
So since this thing is a set 600 pixel width, if we like shrunk our screen down to like 300 pixels of width, it would just be cut off on the edges, right?
It will actually, so as it explains here, it actually creates a horizontal scroll bar.
Oh,
so,
okay.
So right now, I just set it so that we can shrink this document. So like if you see here,
yeah.
I see a scroll bar here because I'm saying like you have to take up 600 pixels of space. So it's going to take up the space it says it needs. Okay, not responsive. Okay. All right, so the other thing you can do is set a max width. So the biggest this thing can be is 600 pixels. But that's a particular CSS property you can set on an HTML item. Okay, so when you do that, then the mobile browser will deal with, okay, it could be smaller if it needs to be. But the largest it can be and the largest it should be is this pixel width. So that automatically starts creating some level of responsiveness, right, to a screen.
So could you change the speed solution? When you can change the speed resolution, right?
Oh yeah, so I could be doing this from like by doing this or like setting the size, right? It's still not gonna make itself any bigger than it should be. I don't know if that explained what you were asking, but that's another way to like see how things work. Okay, so we already talked about the box model, but it's something to keep in mind. So when you set the width of an element, the element can actually appear bigger than what you set based on border and padding and how those things set up. So both of these boxes are being set with 500 pixels width, okay? But the fancy one is actually adding padding between the content and the border. So it's gonna end up bigger than the width actually expects it to be. So it's something to keep in mind when you're setting all of these four elements, when you're setting all of these four properties, that width doesn't always like add up to the percent that you want or the pixels length that you want. The other pieces that come into play are like the padding you set and the border width, for example. Things that are inside and outside your element can shift the way that ends up getting rendered on the screen. Okay, so like, yeah, that's something that you have to keep in mind. Box sizing is how that gets fixed. So then you would utilize this property called box sizing, and then it makes both of them the same size because it shifts the math to being like, I expect both of these, like the most important, if the most important property is that it needs to be 500 width, you can utilize box sizing to change the inner math so that it absolutely ends up being 500, like that those properties calculate up to 500 width instead of starting the element at 500 width and then adding on the calculations of, you know, the padding or the border that will shift 500 plus padding plus border. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So you see that coming up in here. Okay. And some people on CSS will set this way, border box, or this box sizing, so that no matter what, it's going to use that math, and that you know that when you say I want a 500 pixel box, it's going to exactly be 500 pixels. Okay.
Since my website is 20 slides,
Yes, super useful. Okay, and WebKit and Moz are referring to the different types of user agents that exist. You'll see Gecko or WebKit or Mozilla we referred to that earlier. Those are just different structures of browsers that are implementing certain ways of doing things. So you'll see, like, for example, it talks about this here, like IE8, like IE8 works a certain way. Okay, that's what's going on there. So now let's get into position again. So we talked about static being the default position, right? Everything has a default static position to the flow of a document, okay? From there, relative will be setting up where you are going to end up relative to the position that you had originally been set up in the document, okay? So these two boxes here, relative 1, it's just saying it's the same as static. Okay, so relative is the same as static until you put the context, right? I'm only relative when I say I'm relative to the start, and then like add extra things like to the right, 20 pixels down, 20 pixels to the left, okay, 20 pixels, you know, up. Okay, so that will move me from my understood static position. Okay, so the relative to is saying like, you know, top negative 20 means that move me up 20 pixels. So negative is like a 0 axis, and then negative is going to move me up. Does that make sense to everybody? So you sometimes will see negative pixel space, and then to the left 20. So if to the left negative 20 would have actually moved you right. Does that make sense? And then width 500, so it's just saying like set it as this particular property. The background color white here is useful for what? How does anybody see where that's coming into play? Where they're overlapping, right? You don't see the green coming through this next box. It's because they set the background color of that box to white, so it looks like it's sitting in front, but in reality, they're kind of just overlapping each other, okay? But stylistically, you want it to look like one box is in front of the other. That's how you do that magic, okay? Fixed, we've kind of already seen here just when we talked about it. I mean, just when we loaded the page. Like, no matter how much scrolling I do, that box is gonna stay put right there, it's fixed, okay? And then absolute is weird because it's relative to the nearest positioned ancestor as opposed to relative to the viewpoint. The relative to the viewport is like fixed. Like, I mean, the viewport, when you do fixed, it's saying like, wherever I tell you to be in the viewport, just put me there, that's it. Absolute is saying like relative to the document, you'll show up. See, like this will absolutely stay right here. But it's still scrolling with the flow of the document. Okay, so it's still kind of like in the flow of the document. Or it's still like a part of the document, whereas this is like totally outside of the document to the level that it's just fixed to the viewport. Yeah. Yeah, this one in the corner is fixed.
What's the difference between fixed and sticky?
Good question. Let me get back to you on the specifics of fixed versus sticky. They work in very similar ways. Sticky didn't always exist, whereas fixed has. But when we have like progressed in CSS, sticky toolbars and that kind of thing.
Well, the fixed will run over stuff. So sticky like kind of moving the plane or something.
I feel like the difference might be that it's not like it's still in the flow of the document in some ways, and it only becomes sticky at a certain point of the flow of the document. But I could be wrong. But that's something I'll make sure to research for y'all. Okay. That's also why, did I put it in my slides? I feel like that's why I didn't put it in my slides as well. It was in there? Okay. I put it in there because it gets used and people are like, how do I make it sticky, right? But it's somewhat recent and it's complicated. But fixed bot was probably like, maybe it's like under the hood using fixed in some way, or using the same functionalities that fix uses. Make sense? So all these div live in HTML and they can get moved around based on their the setting of position. Make sense?
I remember doing some like HTML stuff. One of them is like, yeah, like in the flow of the document. So like the stuff disappears behind it, but if it's sticky, you would end right at the you wouldn't have like words on your page underneath the sticky, but you have words on your page underneath the fixed.
Okay.
Like the page would end at the like in other words, it's like an inline, not inline. No, what's the term for that? Is it inline term? Like it's basically an inline box.
Yeah.
Blocking any text from going underneath it. Whereas,
yeah, that might be a characteristic of sticky. So this is another example of like a fixed header that is setting this into play. So we have a container. So we're going to see a container HTML element, a nav HTML element, a position HTML element, or a section, I mean, and a footer. So the footer you're seeing here, it's fixed. So we're saying the height is 70 pixels, background color white, width 100, saying take up the whole space. Okay, bottom left 0, bottom 0, left 0. And then this, so this is how you're starting to see like, oh, this is how websites are made, right? This is how a normal website looks. So you have a large container, see this green setup here? So you have a large container that takes up basically, it wraps your whole actual content that you want to show, and it gives a good like spacing in between the actual white background or whatever background you have to your actual document, okay? And it kind of just like hugs everything. You'll see this very often, a class named container, okay? Especially in frameworks. But you can make it, you can use it yourself, right? It's just a very commonly used word for like the wrap of stuff that I'm about to show the user as being inside the body. So you'll see like class body and then like class main and then class container, or class container and then class main. Like this is my main content. Make sense to everybody? So then we have the class container here at the top that's wrapping everything. And then you have nav, 2 sections, or 3 sections, there you go. And then you have a footer here at the bottom, okay? So the container was set up so that it's relative. So position relative is just right now, I guess, performing almost like static, because we're not setting anything in here, but it might be inherited by the children. Okay, so that might be a curiosity here that's coming into play, right? Nav was something that was here at the left, right? That's also using, that one's using absolute. We're saying left, so take up, that should be 0 pixels, and then width should only take up 200 pixels. Okay, so it's saying like, you know, sit in the container but only take up 200 pixels, and I'm absolutely staying right here, right? Sections are just staying in static, which is fine. It's just going to continue to flow. So every section is just going to be set up like a block level thing. Okay, and then margin left, 200 pixels. Why? It's going to give space to the nav section to sit next to it. So it looks like they are, they're being placed right next to each other, but they're actually just making space for this to stay on this side. Okay,
And then for all the sections, it's going to keep them all spaced to the right.
Yeah,
Nav's gonna
because
be
you're
here,
giving a
all the sections are
margin.
gonna be in there.
So you're saying, yeah, so you're basically saying like, you need to stay this far, like you should stay this far away from me, but this one is set up absolute. So it looks like they're sitting right next to each other, but one is set absolute and one is set relative, right? That's what's happening here. Or section is staying, section is being static to the flow. The nav is set absolute and should stay to the left no matter what at 0 pixels and should only take up 200 pixels of space. Okay, so that way it looks like even if this section, for example, is down here and it's not touching this nav, it's still like giving the illusion that it's giving the nav a full space that it needs. And it'll all the text will start here. So, oh, let's see what happens when you resize your browser. Let's see what happens.
Whoa. Cool.
How do you stop them for? So why aren't they block elements? Why isn't the nav doesn't have to use a block? Or does it specify inline?
Right. So if nav was set up as a block element, well, we should see if natively if it's block or inline, because I can't recall if nav is block or inline natively. But that might have something to do with the reason why they're setting it as like, you absolutely need to stay here. You're only taking this much space up, and the sections are going to take up only this much space and give you all the space you need to stay on this side.
That changes when you do absolute. It changes it, not like block.
No, it doesn't change it from inline to block, but it might be performing this way based on the fact that it's probably inline or probably block, which one I can't recall right now for nav specifically, but I'll make sure to clarify that afterwards.
Can you downsize one more time? Let me see the footer.
Yeah, so right here, footer is definitely just taking up 100% of the space. That's what the width is 200 pixels.
How come footer is move around? Footer is set that space, right?
Oh, width is 100%, that's why. Width is 100%. So no matter what I do, I'm taking 100% of the space. So that's the benefit to using percent when you're doing measurements than using pixels. Because if I said 200 pixels, it's only going to take up 200 pixels of space, no matter how much space I give it. But to 100% just means whatever amount there is, I get 100% of it. Right?
Bottom 0.
Yeah, it's like, I want 50% of the pie. I don't care how big or small the pie is.
And the width, you said the maximum is 600, right?
It depends on the screen. So it's not like a max, right? Like this projector probably utilizes, I don't know how many pixels on this, imagine like a huge TV screen or like a huge conference projector, right? Like that screen width might be able to take up way more space, right? Your phone takes up way less space than my 13-inch monitor or your 52-inch monitor, right?
Or you prefer to use
Whoa, did I get kicked out? What just happened?
Peter took us down.
No, it's probably John.
You got in the hall call?
Peter, we can tell you for the last hour. It's not
Oh, that
Did anybody notice?
sucks. Did I get... Oh, good, it's still recording. That's weird. How is it still recording? Okay. Okay. Outside of that, let's keep going because I don't really know what just happened right now. So float is another functionality of setting your layout up. So notice this cute hamster picture. Is it a hamster or guinea pig? Oh, I used to have guinea pigs. Okay, so this cute picture, right? It looks like it's like sitting in this div, right? And all the text is flowing around this picture, right? Pretty fancy. Okay, so the way that that's happening is through float. So we're saying this image should float right inside the div, and then we're setting a particular margin. Okay, so that will allow this div to like just move to the other side. Okay, so it almost, instead of them stacking like this, it just like puts them like this. It floats them right next to it. Okay. This paragraph text is probably inside. I don't know why I didn't show the actual. This text is probably a paragraph inside of a larger, like this larger gray div, and then this image is also probably inside of the div. So instead of them stacking on top of each other, float right is going to move it to the side of the div, and then let the text flow along it. Pretty sure that's what's happening. Okay. So the clear property is useful for in determining how floats are going to work. So it's like you're clearing space for the float to work. Okay. So for these two things, you have a div class box and then a section. The section, so what it's saying here is the section is actually after the div, written in here, right? So I have a box and a section that's supposed to stack up on top of each other, right? But for the box, I'm saying float it left, right? And give it a width of 200 pixels, a height of 100 pixels, okay? The section, so when you float it to the left, you're basically, you're allowing them to kind of like sit on top of each other, right? So using float. So float left means like, kind of like come out of the document a tiny bit, and then the next line of HTML will move into the space that the floated element lives in. Yeah. So it kind of like floats inside the prior element, and then the text is going to behave in a particular way. So it'll kind of move around the div information, like the div that's taking up some space.
So what you're saying is when you put it inside the element, they put the class box inside of. They put.
It might, it might. But the usefulness of this is that you're writing, how do I explain the usefulness of this? It's useful when you're dealing with like, if this paragraph was longer than this, the text would end up after this like that. Whereas if you didn't do it that way, it would like, you would have to do a lot of additional CSS to make sure that it's using like text flow the way that you expect it to. Okay, so if you did clear, where here it's saying, okay, so this one is setting a class after box to the section. So it's saying like clear the floated object and then move on. So clear left means like move past the floated left object. Don't just sit on top of it, just clear it. It's almost like jump over the float instead of like letting the float interfere with what you're doing. Okay, so you're clearing the elements floated to the left. And then you can also clear right in both. So if you have like clear right image, clear left image, clear right image, and you want to like clear both, then the section will jump dependent on the differentiation. Oh, this might happen when you're using floats. So this picture is really cool, but it's like way bigger than this div, the text that's written in this div. So it looks really weird because you like, maybe you have a border like this and you see that it's like flowing over the div, right? Because the div's only going to take up the space, the content in that div, right? And that image is not technically inside that div. So to fix it, you change overflow to be auto. Again, this is another way auto gets utilized. Okay, so the overflow property is saying, like, for this div, make sure that like whatever object whatever element that I have that I want to utilize, just set it so that like there's no overflow problems that are going to happen, so that it'll shift the box to make way for the image. Okay, so that it's not like, yes. But sometimes you want overflow, like maybe you would set overflow to be hidden so that like it looks like the picture is sitting in the div and it cuts the image off at a certain space. So that's how the overflow sometimes gets utilized. Yeah. I was like, what's happening? Okay. So it's just floating right. It's just floating the image right. But the div, because the images float right, this div is like, you know, it's moving up in order, right? And then this floated image is like sitting kind of like over the div, right? And so the div only takes up this much space, right? But when you use overflow auto, it's like, hey, I know there's a floated thing here, so just use up the space that's necessary for both of these things to sit together appropriately.
If you had more text in the one above, because it looks like it's in some kind of auto, like there's no like set height it should be and stuff.
Yeah.
So, but if you had a bunch more text, it would probably be. Like,
yeah, it'll probably do that. But then again, if this was looked at like
changes, like
smaller, like this, see how that changes? So it's like, yeah, it did, but not the way you want it to, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you scroll down and look at this one, like it's changing no matter what the image looks like, right? So it's gonna kind of go with this flow.
Is
Okay.
there a way to cut off the image where, like, you know, after the text from the image, it's like if you want to, like.
So the way to cut this, it would be overflow. There's another setting in overflow. Instead of using auto, you would say like overflow hidden or something like that, and then it would just cut. It would cut off the image after the edge of that div.
What about resizing the image?
You could totally resize the image as well. So again, like there's like 20 ways you can do something, but it depends on what behavior do you want, like what styles do you want reflected? Do you want it to look like, you know, this image is just like a peep, and, you know, or do you want it to just be like, this image is directly relevant to this div, so we want it to like all be together? Or do you want it to, like, this just depends on how you want to do it. Or does this look cool like this, where it's like, here's some text and then here's an image. So that's how you would deal with that. You can play with overflow auto and see how it works with floated objects or floated elements. Okay. So there's, again, like using float, you can do a very similar functionality of the sections and the nav being set up this way. So instead of when we set nav to be like absolute, right? We just floated it so that it came up into the container in that way. We still set the sections to be margin left, but it's just like floating and taking up this much space. We already talked a little bit about why percent width is useful. You can also use min width and max width. So it'll shift the way that this image looks. So that, Taylor, you were speaking about like images, like the size of an image, right? Like, so right now this image is tiny, but it's enough to like fit the screen the way it needs to, right? And then as we stretch it out, it's bigger and smaller. So
What's that called, sorry?
this is using, for images, you can use width percentages instead of actual, like this picture should be 500 pixels, instead saying this picture should be 50% of the width that it's that it has available to it. Okay, so then 50% of whatever size pie it is, I'm just going to take 50% of it. Okay, so again, same thing here. It's just going to take up 25% that it needs to. So again, the good thing about this example is it's showing you these are 3 different ways I've made this same setup using, using position, using float, and now using percent in here. Make sense? Media queries speak a little closer to how mobile responsiveness comes into play. If I have a mobile size screen, I would set like, if the screen's like the minimum width it can be is 600 pixels, do this. If an expected screen is a larger percentage, do that. Okay? So that's going to change the way that the styles are going to be applied based on the screen size. What's the thing? Oh, this middle thing? Yeah. All right. Okay. So you see here, there's some applied styles depending on the screen width. So when I change the screen width, it's going to change the way this stuff is set up. Boop. You see that magic? Okay, this is how your phone is like, this is how responsiveness works, right? For the most part. So I'm saying like if I have a tiny screen, just stack them. Okay? Hold on, let me make it. Okay, so it's saying, so it's a at media, so it's a media query. And then we say, so for a media screen where the minimum width is 600 pixels, make it look like they're sitting next to each other, right? Like a regular website. But then when the max width is 599 pixels, when I have a screen that's less than 600 pixels, stack them, make them inline. Stack them and then display it inline. So it's like just change the way the nav is set up so that it's like they're inline, they all sit next to each other. Okay, so a media query will separate out how you want something to display based on screen width. It's a media query. So you're saying when there's multiple media query kinds of lines, so it's not just like screen. You might see something like the role or something like that. I can send y'all a link for like how different media queries are written. But for the most part, you'll see something that looks like this: media screen, and like when it's a media, when it's like a screen, and the width of that screen is this. So this is almost like an if-else statement. Okay, a media query is kind of like an if-else statement. So if this applies, do this. Otherwise, if this applies, do that. Right, so this did not end up happening, right? The section took up all the space it needed. Okay, so it might be that a section is by default a block. And it's just taking up all the space it can. Okay. Oh, great. Popular sites use media queries. Here's the documentation for how to use it. I don't even have to give you it. Boom. Now you know where to get it, okay? And then other information, media viewport. This site's called learnlayout.com. I gave you all a link for in today's curriculum, so you'll have it.
How do you access the Google.com? It's like it's inside the computer. Wait, in the computer.
Yeah, in the mainframe itself. Okay.
Where is it inside the computer?
You have to tap the mainframe.
All right, y'all. So Inline-Block is something that you might see. You can use stuff float, right, left to like set things up. And this is telling you like how Inline-Block can set up a bunch of things floating next to each other and giving each other some set of margin. Okay, so
Where's the space? So the space in between each one of the boxes, how is that indicated in margin?
ooh, good question. So we're having things for every box. So these are a bunch of, it's a div class box. This is basically what y'all did, right, yesterday. You have a div class box. These are all div classes, box. And then there's one here, after box. I'm using clear so I don't float next to the above boxes. So this box, clear left, so everything is floating left. And then that other section is like, okay, I can jump over all those floated boxes, right? And then the width is being set, the height is being set, and you have a margin 1 EM. Remember what EM means? Anyone? It's multiplying to the height of the text. So even though it says 1, it's actually like a pretty large, substantial size. It calculates out to, we can check if you want. It calculates out to certain sizing. We look at box. Where's box? Okay, so it says 1 EM here, and then if we go to calculated, so that margin is actually 16 pixels. Okay, and that 16 pixels was calculated by the fact that it is the font size also 1 EM, or line height.
Can you make the drop down anything? The one said 1 EM above.
So if I change it to do, it changes to 32. So it doubled in size. Does that make sense to everybody? So EM is dependent on text size. PX, pixels, is just that is the size, that's it. Okay? The good thing about EM is that, like, if you have bigger text or smaller text, the size that text needs is relative, right? That's why you would utilize EM versus PX. Because like 20 size, like a 50 pixel text box might need more spacing between it and a border than a 10 pixel box, right? Like it'll need like way more padding relative to the border.
Or I guess if it's margin, right? If it's just like a really big text, you just want more space to the next thing.
Right. Yeah. See, like this doesn't make sense, but that makes sense, right? So it's relative to the text. EM. Help. That's how that's happening. Okay. So these are all floating, and then the clear box just says like, I'm just going to jump over everyone. Okay. So the easy way of so the hard way of doing that is using float. Float left. So float left doesn't make sense. You don't, like, these are not necessarily to the left of the page. So like every box being float left, just so that the section at the bottom can clear all of them, doesn't make sense. So instead you would use Inline-Block. So Inline-Block means that all these boxes are inline blocks. That means that it's taking up all the space that it needs, but it's also like not requiring the next section to have to clear them. It just says, I'm the next in line, so I'm just going to go next at the bottom. Okay, so instead of using float, you can use Inline-Block. That's what it's saying here.
Can you look at HTML for these as well?
Yeah, you can. You can, but like, yeah, the part of the reason why it's displaying it this way is that it's showing like these HTML divs are being they're being styled this way because of the CSS. But yeah, you can definitely.
When they say left, like when they say left,
exactly. Right. So that's the exact point of like why this is not as good as using Inline-Block. Inline-Block makes more sense. They're not left, right? They're not like visually left. They're just needing to all be together as a group, and that the next thing should just naturally come after, instead of calling all these clear left and then making this section be, or making all of these float left and then calling this clear to clear all the left boxes when in fact they're not all left. They're just boxes that need to be jumped over for the section. Okay. We're almost done with this. I only have 5 more minutes to show this stuff to you. So I'm gonna skip over this inline block. But again, it's showing you another way that you would use the same format, structured, utilizing inline block. Column is another way to set things up. This is using grid systems. So you can use, this also feels a lot like how you'll see frameworks being utilized. So you have this like 3 columns of text. You can set column count to 3 and then column gap, the space between the columns, to 1 EM.
All 3 of those groups of things are doing the same thing.
This,
one for Mozilla, one for WebKit, one
yes,
for default.
yes. That's the frustration with having so many different browsers, being like we're team Mozilla, we're team Chrome, we're team IE. So that means like we're doing our own thing. So then CSS people have to accommodate all of these browsers. It's frustrating, right? So again, you get to see the point of like, I don't know who's going to use my stuff. I just need to accommodate for everyone. So once you get to this point, it's like, do I have to continue writing all this stuff, or should I use a framework that's going to help me accommodate for everyone?
Okay. So when we get to that framework, you're going to help us. Like,
Yeah. So then you realize, like, I'm not going to be able to keep up with all of this.
yeah.
Maybe I should use Bootstrap that already has this class called 3 column that will do this work for me. Then I don't have to write the CSS itself. Okay, like spoiler alert for frameworks. Okay, Flexbox layout mode does a lot of this stuff as well. So you have something you set up like called flex, and then from there you can set up certain things like flex column 1 or flex this kind of thing. So then it'll set it up so that when you're doing this kind of work, it doesn't really use this. So you do stuff like this when you use flex. Okay, so then you're explaining here like how these boxes should work based on the layout of the page. Sometimes it doesn't mean it's responsive. It just means that like I want to set up my divs to like have a specific layout in terms of a grid, columns, and rows. So the Flexbox is a way to do that. So you can use things like center the items, justify the content, that kind of thing. So then you can do stuff like this without doing the math of like, oh, how big does this need to be compared to that? You can just use Flexbox to set that stuff up natively. Okay, last one. Oh, this kind of speaks to frameworks. So I'm going to jump over to my escape, my other present. Real quick, 4 minutes. This is like a quick thing anyway. What the framework? We're going to talk about frameworks, front-end frameworks. We'll allude to those things that we saw in this last Learn CSS layout. Okay, front-end is hard, right? We just explained how all the 20 different ways you can line up one thing, right? It's really, really annoying. And it's awesome, but it's also like a lot of work. Like, why am I doing all this work? Okay, frameworks are here to save your life. Okay, especially for beginners, right? It's a library of code. Okay, so framework, just like Rails, just like everything else that we've talked about so far, gems, packages, right? It's a library of work somebody else did or a team of other people did, right? They spent all this time so that everybody else doesn't have to spend that same time. It's like somebody else already wrote it. Let's just take advantage of the library that somebody else wrote, okay? Pros to using it. It's quick, okay? It's dry. I'm not repeating myself because somebody else already did the work, okay? I'm not reinventing the wheel because somebody already thought about what it means to adhere to accessibility standards. Somebody already thought about the complexity of the CSS math that it takes in order to use like a certain percentage of width of setting things up? Or like, what if I have 20 different screens? Like, how do I make sure I'm accommodating for all those screens, right? Like, why should I have to answer that question when a whole team of people have already like expertisely done this? Use their framework, right? Prototyping, like, I ain't got time for this. I just need to show somebody that I'm gonna make $1 billion if I finish this website, right? Super easy way to get something up and running. Cons, big, libraries are big, right? Like you'll see soon, like Rails is a behemoth, right? Some frameworks give you it's like saying like, here, just use my library. Here's like the book, right? It could also, in performance standpoint, be way too much stuff. Like all I wanted was to use like 2 classes. Is it worth then downloading 2 gigabytes of stuff that you're never going to use? Probably not, right? So at that point, you need to determine, is it really worth it for me to use this library if I have to take the whole shebang with me, right? In order to use 2 things, yes or no? So it could create performance issues, which is the second part, slow, right? It feels magical, right? It's doing all this stuff for you. It's abstracting a lot of the work that's being done. So sometimes that's horrible, right? It's like, oh, how do I change this thing? I changed 1 letter and now it's just doing all this other stuff, right? So it feels really magical. That could be a detriment. Convention over configuration. You hear that a lot when we get to Rails, but that's really what's happening. Hello, I think you're actually gonna be in the conference room, which is further down the hallway. You'll see it to the right, okay? So yay, we're gonna use frameworks today, particularly Bootstrap, okay? So these are a few that you can use. Bootstrap is the most popular. You'll also hear Foundation, Semantic UI, Materialize. These are different frameworks. All of these are links, by the way, and I'll give you this document after this, okay? Steps for using it. 1, read the docs, okay? You can't use somebody's library if you don't know the definitions, right? How are you gonna call anything? Oh, the next thing is either downloading the whole library or using a CDN, which is like a link. Remember the link HTML tag? You use the link to like bring that library into your code. You adhere the classes in your HTML. So you say attribute class equals, you know, super